join me in welcoming Michael Freed.
Thanks very much. It's totally great to be here. And in all those years when I was in Baltimore, she was just a fantastic teaching resource for our department. All the actually quite wonderful students that we had in modern art worked with her at the Walters Art Gallery, and she still has a very close working connection with them today. And it's absolutely right. I did a book called The Moment of Caravaggio, which is basically entirely about him. But then there was sort of unfinished business, and there will be a shorter book, basically with 4 chapters and a conclusion, dealing with painting, mainly in Rome, but not just Rome, between Caravaggio's death in 1610 and, let's say, 1630, at which time Italian painting changes. On the one hand, we get the full Baroque of illusionistic ceilings, an artist like Pietro da Cortona, but also the emergence of a new kind of classicism in the art of Nicolas Poussin, and that's the end of this period of artists coming out of Caravaggio. The 4th chapter of the book is on an artist who really doesn't come out of Caravaggio, but is extremely important and extremely interesting. He comes from a town near Bologna, and his name is Guercino. And so this is going to be a lecture on Guercino. It's called Guercino's Anni Mirabilis, his miraculous years, 1619, 1620, chiefly. So my aim in this talk is to say something new and useful about the art of Guercino, Francesco Barbieri, during the years 1619, 1620, which I think of as nothing less than his Anni Mirabilis. A minimum of background. Guercino, which means the squinter, he was kind of cross-eyed, was born in Cento, near Bologna, in 1591, the same year that saw the installation of a large and impressive altarpiece by Ludovico Carracci, an earlier painter, the Holy Family with St. Francis and donors, in the Church of the Cappuccini in that town. Guercino subsequently said he taught himself to paint by studying that canvas. His prodigious gifts, both as a painter and as a draftsman, were recognized at an early age, not least by Ludovico himself. And by the time he was in his mid-20s, he was sought after for commissions. By the late 1610s, he had hit his stride, and during the years 1619, 1620, or let's say 1618, 21 to 1621, to stretch things a bit, he produced a series of ambitious oil paintings of an originality of concept, mastery of execution, and sensuousness of presence that have rarely been equaled in the history of art. While still in Cento, Guercino came to the attention of Alessandro Ludovisi, Cardinal of Bologna, and no doubt at the latter's urging, he moved to Bologna in 1617. Then when Ludovisi was elected Pope, he took the name Gregory XV. In 1621, he brought Guercino to Rome. In the course of the next 2 years, Guercino painted the brilliantly illusionistic ceiling fresco of Aurora at the Villa Ludovisi, and in 1623, the monumental Burial of St. Petronilla, which is on the screen right now, a major work by any standard. And I say this having recently stood somewhat overawed before it in the Vatican Museum. Following Gregory XV's death in 1623, Guercino re-established himself in Cento, where in effect he remained, with occasional campaigns elsewhere, until the death of Guido Reni, another painter, in 1642, led him to transfer his busy shop to Bologna. As long as Reni was in Bologna, Guercino kept a distance, which was very smart. Reni was a fantastically effective operator. And Guercino died a famous and successful painter in 1666. There is a well-known art historical crux concerning Guercino, and although it is not in any sense my topic this afternoon, it deserves mention. Starting during Guercino's stay in Rome, his art changed. At first gradually, but soon quite radically. The intense, melting, chiaroscuro-charged realism of his Cento Bologna period, derived, or rather extrapolated, equally from the Carracci and, in a sense, from Caravaggio, albeit entirely personal as well, giving way to a very different, at once more classical and more theatrical mode of presentation, with a color range now keyed to reds and blues, and no trace whatsoever of the painterly sensuousness that marked his earlier art. In a pioneering work of art historical scholarship called Studies in Seicento Art and Theory of 1947, Dennis Mann associated Guercino's change of style with the classicizing influence of Giovanni Battista Aguzzi, with whose thought the artist would have come into contact in Rome. This is Mann's argument. Since that time, other scholars have taken issue with Mann's arguments, and they have also displayed a range of attitudes towards the change of style itself. Let me say simply that the Aguzzi question is of limited interest to me, though I should make clear that I find Guercino's later production, post-Roman production, supremely competent as it is, of decidedly lesser value artistically speaking than his stupendous paintings of the years just before his Roman adventure. And it's those stupendous paintings we're about to see images of. So let me begin by considering one of Guercino's most important canvases of those years, The Return of the Prodigal Son, of 1619, in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, a type of work that is best described as a gallery picture, a painting of limited but not small dimensions, intended for private ownership by a rich and sophisticated collector who would go on to display it along with other such paintings in his personal exhibition space. The composition, more complex than it at first appears, comprises not one of Guercino's, comprises three men cut off below the waist and displayed against a dark background in the closest imaginable proximity to the picture plane. The subject is based on Jesus' Christ's parable. The prodigal son on the left has just returned to the parental home. He is shown removing his worn, indeed ragged and presumably filthy shirt, and is about to put on instead the elegant new clothes that are now being brought to him by the well-dressed figure at the right, a young man in a feathered hat who most likely is a servant. Sybil Edward Schifferer, the scholar, calls him a page, though conceivably he is the prodigal's older brother, who also figures in Jesus' parable. And between the prodigal son and the servant, as I shall call him, an older man, the son's father, bearded and largely bald, his brow furrowed and his face shadowed, embraces his son with his right arm, as you can see. And we see his right hand cupping the prodigal's back. And with his left arm, he reaches across the servant's left arm, also just past his son's left hand, to grasp the white blouse that presumably he is about to hand to his son. As scholars have noted, the choice of subject matter, the particular moment in the narrative, is unusual. But rather than construe this in icological terms, rather than ask what its symbolic meaning is, I want instead to stress first, as already mentioned, the extreme nearness of all three figures to the picture plane, and by implication to the viewer. Second, the sheer physicality of the scene, a term I mean at this point to have a certain vagueness. Key, in the first place, to the son's muscular physique, but also to the crowdedness of the composition, to the minimizing of facial expression. The son's face in particular is lost in deep shadow. And more broadly, to the play of strong contrasts of light and dark across the composition as a whole, which on the one hand tends to call into question, to undermine our instinctive grasp of the integrity of individual figures, but which on the other hand tends to make of father, son, and servant a single, complexly somatic entity, or perhaps better, somatic field of a distinctive sort. So you get a kind of diffused sense of bodiliness. Two other features of the painting deserve special mention. First, the depicted action of taking off a garment in preparation for putting on others, the full importance of which for Guercino during these years will emerge in stages as this talk proceeds. For the moment, let me say that it is an action, the taking off of the shirt, that is itself conspicuously bodily, in the sense that it requires a sustained effort on the part of the son to carry it off. Not a strenuous effort, but nevertheless a quite particular one, to be followed, of course, by the equally non-strenuous but particular effort of putting on the clean replacement shirt. In both cases, the son is to be imagined feeling, or say sensing, the movement of the cloth across his arms and torso. Another instance of what I've been calling, what I want to call auto-affection, the body's feeling itself. And second, the more than momentary confusion for the viewer caused by the father's reaching gesture, which at first misleadingly appears to continue the outward thrust of the son's left arm, and which has the result of placing 4 active hands belonging to 3 persons in a single area of the canvas. Indeed, the servant's left hand grips a pair of shoes, which the viewer understands. It takes a second. The son will soon put on as well. But the shoes themselves insert a further note of confusion by suggesting that they are being offered for the son to take as soon as he removes his shirt. So we've got something here that's giving us, making us take it in with some kind of effort, right, to see what's going on. Now, I have no wish to take particular issue with the art historian I mentioned a moment ago, Sybil Ebert-Schifferer, the author of an important essay in the 1991 Guercino exhibition catalog. But when she writes of this painting, quote, "This is a calm, self-enclosed family picture. Placement of the figures close to the picture plane draws the viewer into a mood of trusting abandonment on the one hand, and of long absorption on the other," unquote. Something important, I think, is not being acknowledged. That the viewer is drawn imaginatively into a particular relation to the painting or to the scene it depicts seems right, as does the notion that this has much to do with the nearness of the figures to the picture plane. But trusting abandonment does not seem quite apt, at least not unless it is first recognized how much is being asked of the viewer by way of eliciting his or her trust. I mean coming to terms with, registering, and somehow processing the deliberately confusing concatenation of actions and gestures in the right-hand half of the canvas. And long absorption is fine, just so long as it is acknowledged to what extent the figures themselves are not seen as especially absorbed in what they're doing or feeling. In this, Guercino differs both from Caravaggio and from many of his best-known followers, who typically juxtapose absorbed and viewer-addressing figures in their tavern scenes of similar compositions. This just isn't part of Guercino's MO. Indeed, almost no emphasis falls on individual psychology or expression, for that matter on inwardness in any form. That simply isn't Guercino's concern, not in this canvas, not, in fact, hardly ever. A page or so further on in her essay, Ebert-Schifferer observes that the later return of the Prodigal Son, of around 1627-28, today in the Galleria Borghese in Rome, quote, seeks a direct confrontation with the viewer rather than the viewer's inclusion within the picture, unquote, as in the Vienna canvas. By direct confrontation, I take Ebert-Schifferer to be accurately registering the fact that as regards composition, clear, stable, progressive, the treatment of light and dark, respecting the integrity of forms, spotlighting the son's arm and sleeve, and indeed the nature of the action, no confusing gestures, a clear separation of figures, a general absence of dynamism, the little dog leaping up between the son and the viewer. The Borghese canvas, which we're looking at, suggests a much less challenging, much more conventional relation to its audience than does its Vienna predecessor. As for Ebert-Schifferer's notion of inclusion, the viewer is included in the other, which he associates with the earlier work, I take it as a further gloss on trusting abandonment, and think it is acute. Not that one can quite demonstrate the viewer's inclusion as such, but to see the Vienna picture, just to show it to you again, as seeking by a variety of means to establish, or at least to suggest, a more than just illusionistically proximate, in that sense, almost somatically involving, but at the same time distinctly non-affective, non-psychological relation between painting and viewer seems about right. None of this is easy to put into words, which very likely is why Guercino remains so strikingly, not understudied exactly, though that too is the case, but under-analyzed and under-characterized. So what is at stake in all this becomes clearer when we consider a slightly later painting, but one still in our target period. Herminia and the Shepherd, around 1619 and 1620, in Birmingham, in England. The subject, apparently chosen by Guercino himself, is taken from the 7th canto of Tasso's Gerusalemme Liberata, a major poem of the late 16th century. Quote, where Herminia, in search of her beloved Tancred, has outdistanced her Christian pursuers, she finds herself in a pastoral atmosphere, far from the stresses of war, the accoutrements of which she lays aside. She has been wearing armor, and she encounters an old shepherd engaged in weaving baskets and living a simple, idyllic life. This comes from the entry on the painting in that same exhibition catalog. This is true enough, but the deeper interest of the work is captured by a young scholar named Shilpa Prasad in her important Johns Hopkins dissertation, where she observes that in Tasso's poem, Herminia comes upon not just the shepherd, but also his 3 sons, quote, who sing and play in the poem. And goes on to suggest, Prasad goes on to suggest, that Herminia's gesture in Guercino's canvas is to be understood as asking where the music that she hears is coming from. In response to which the shepherd points with his left hand towards 3 youths who are themselves to be imagined as located this side of the picture surface, i.e. in the same space or world as the viewer. Such an implication, which seems beyond question, it seems right, is consistent with the painting's stress on the extreme nearness of the figures to the picture plane, in which respect it surpasses even the Vienna Return of the Prodigal Son. And that's in effect made all the more impressive by virtue of the fact that both figures in this picture, being seated, are shown in their full length. This last point is a stroke of something like genius, and it follows on from slightly earlier compositions, such as Herminia discovering the wounded Tancred of 1619 in Rome, and Saint Sebastian, a painting we will see, Saint Sebastian being succored, 1619 in Bologna, both of which feature a muscular young wounded man stretched out on the ground and being tended to by a beautiful woman. In Herminia and the Shepherd, the 2 figures virtually fill the canvas. Almost no effort has been made to construct a spatial container for them. The bit of Ferreri's landscape background to the right is appealing but nominal. And as in The Return of the Prodigal Son, the Vienna, but even more strikingly, facial expressions play almost no role whatsoever. Herminia's face is a charming mask. The shepherd's is mostly lost in shadow. Instead, the emphasis falls on Herminia's upraised, open left hand, the pointing left hand of the shepherd, which crosses his right hand and wrist. Notice that. I'm going to say more about that. And the shepherd's crossed feet, especially his left foot, with its creased and calloused sole. As you will see, Guercino loves the sole of the foot. Indeed, there's a rhyme of sorts between her left palm and his left sole, both of which are registered by the viewer as what might be called vehicles of sensuous receptivity. Again, it's difficult to know exactly how to characterize what Guercino has so pointedly done. What comes to mind is the German poet Rainer Maria Rilke's lyric Handinneres, palm of the hand, which begins, Innerst der Hand, Sohle, die nicht mehr geht als auf Gefühl, palm of the hand, soul that no longer goes except on feeling. Note, by the way, how Herminia's hand is seconded by the tree beyond it, which seems almost to mime her gesture of inquiry and surprise. It matters, too, that the shepherd's body is largely unclothed, and even more, that despite his apparent age, he is muscular and energetic seeming from head to foot. Herminia, of course, is clothed, but she conveys an expansive sensuousness. And in light of what is to come in this talk, it should be emphasized that she is divesting of herself of her armor. She is disrobing, in other words. As for Saint Sebastian, succored, 1619 in Bologna, a work of tremendous distinction. Let me point out first, once more, the nearness of all five figures to the picture plane. Second, the subordination of space and context to the five somewhat massive-seeming figures themselves, for whom there's barely room within the low framing rectangle. Third, the unusually intense evocation of the collective absorption of Irene, the left, the doctor, assuming that's who he is, and the young man at the right, in the doctor's attempt to remove an arrow from Sebastian's forearm. That kind of collective absorption is not usual in Guercino. Fourth, the bright white cloth covering Sebastian's groin, and another bit of cloth that hangs down unexpectedly from beneath the pillow, beneath his head, below his head, as if indeed both belong to a single length of material, a single length of white cloth. And my suggestion is that Guercino has a larger stake in this than you might think. And fifth, the way in which the far from strictly logical play of strong chiaroscuro, contrasts of light and dark across the surface of the canvas, works against the viewer's sense of the integrity, the integralness of any single body, most conspicuously that of the almost naked Sebastian. The last point is driven home by an unexpected and in obvious respects unnatural arrangement of limbs. The fact that Sebastian's left leg crosses his right leg in the vicinity of the latter's knee, in consequence of which our attention is drawn by his illuminated left thigh, and then by his not quite equally illuminated lower right leg and foot. Do you see what I mean? In other words, the crossing there and the play of the light makes us work very hard to figure out where the limbs are and how it works. This in itself is intensely interesting, but in fact the motif of crossing limbs plays a surprisingly large role in Guercino's art during these years, culminating thematically in the compositionally startling Jacob blessing the sons of Joseph, 1620 in Dublin, in which Joseph intervenes to try to prevent his father from giving the right hand blessing to his youngest son, Ephraim. The patriarch's cross-handed gesture seizes the viewer's gaze as it spells out Jacob's intentions with perfect clarity. Guercino is a master composer of pictures. I mean, it's simply remarkable the way in which when one approaches this picture, one's attention is just taken more or less immediately and compelled by that cross-handed gesture. It would be fascinating to know whether this subject too was chosen by the artist, for whom the crossing of arms and legs appears to have been a way at once of thematizing embodiment and of undermining by complicating too easy or identificatory an impression of bodily wholeness. And I'm going to say more about this as we go on. Or alternatively, in a simpler seeming canvas, Salome visiting St. John the Baptist in prison, and a remarkable subject, circa 1620. It's a way of aligning right and left hands within the painting with the viewers and painters' right and left hands outside. If what I mean is Guercino or we standing in front of the painting can have our own right hand in relation to the figure's right hand, our own left hand in relation to the figure's left hand, but the crossing makes that possible. But at the same time, by virtue of that very crossing, this subverts the rapprochement between painting and viewer that such a congruence might seem to invite. On the one hand, we can line up our right with his right, our left with his left. At the same time, the crossing thrusts us away. In fact, the Salome visiting St. John may be seen as commenting on this state of affairs, but even say allegorizing this state of affairs. It is depiction of Salome pressing her face through the bars, and that itself is remarkable. I mean, you never see a painting where someone is visiting someone else in prison and their face literally comes through the bars, while at the same time the bars keep her firmly separated from him. So this play of proximity and distancing, this kind of permanent tension between the two, is happening again and again in these pictures. Crossed hands and figures in close proximity to the picture plane are prominent in still another ambitious painting of roughly the same moment, the Raising of Lazarus, 1619, in the Louvre. But what I want particularly to emphasize is first the open sepulchre, the open grave in the right extreme foreground of the composition, which is an anticipation of the far more developed use of that motif in the Saint Petronilla. I didn't stop to point that out to you. And second, the gesture of the man peering down into the sepulchre, who with his left hand doesn't matter. Covers his nose and mouth in response to what we are to understand is the sickening odor emanating from it. This, too, is a bodily trope, one specifically keyed to a sense, smell, that differs from those traditionally associated with painting, sight, and touch. Sight inevitably, touch illusionistically, in that it has to do with experiences that are essentially immersive or indeed invasive, not only dissolving all sense of distance between subject and object, but at least potentially overwhelming the subject, the viewer, by virtue of the sheer unpleasantness of the sensation in question, as in this canvas. Put slightly differently, the theme of odor in the Raising of Lazarus is comparable to that of music in Herminia and the Shepherd, in that both cases it has the effect of reinforcing, I would like to say it's intended to reinforce, the implication of something like multi-sensory communication between the world of the painting and the world this side of the picture surface. Though there is in the Herminia and the Shepherd not the slightest suggestion that the sounds Herminia hears are unpleasant, quite the contrary. But what might be called an immersive mode of experience is evoked in both. Another immersive experience picture is the marvelous St. Francis in Ecstasy with St. Benedict, 1620, in the Louvre, in which Francis appears all but overcome by the angel's violin playing. At any rate, he recoils from the music as if in excruciating pain and raises his right arm and hand to ward it off, even as the largely undraped, surprisingly masculine and muscular angel seated on a cloud gives the impression of playing expressly for him with great fervor. Benedict, robed in white and looking upward, seems almost an afterthought. In other words, in the St. Francis in Ecstasy, Guercino found a way to return to the theme of music first broached in the Herminia and the Shepherd, but also to do so in terms that insist on its invasiveness and its penetratingness. Another theme, not quite the right word, but let it stand, that has been noted more than once, but about which there's more to say, is that of the naked or partly naked male or female body in relation to its clothing or drapery. I touched on this before. The Vienna Return of the Prodigal Son probably goes further in that direction than any of the other paintings we've considered, with its protagonist removing his tattered shirt and about to put on clean and expensive garments, while the risen but still seated Lazarus is shown being freed from the strips of cloth binding his wrists. Others had bound his feet and covered his face, just to give you a glimpse of that again. In response to Christ's command, quote, unwrap him and let him go, unquote. And my suggestion is that some measure of Guercino's interest in the subject had to do with this particular subtext, unwrap him and let him go. Or consider a truly astonishing picture, the Taking of Christ, 1621, at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, England. Doubly influenced by Ludovico Carracci, there's a canvas at Princeton, and Caravaggio, a great picture in Dublin. But featuring a character present in neither of those works, the bare-headed thug at the lower right, who grasps Jesus' shirt or undergarment at breast height with his right hand, and tugs with his left at a double length of red clothing, like a belt or sash. What is it, though, exactly, that emerges bizarrely from beneath Jesus' cloak? A motif for which I know no precedent in earlier versions of the subject. I mean, of course, this. It's incredibly strange when you're standing in front of him. He's pulling this from under Jesus' clothing. The impression this makes is distinctly unpleasant, as if it were a violation of the integrity of Christ's body in some unspecified sense. In any case, it more than anything else claims one's attention standing before the picture. Though something else that one dwells on is the initially confusing treatment of Judas at the left, who at first seems to have his back turned towards the viewer, but finally is seen as recoiling from Christ following his kiss while clutching his bag of coins in his left hand, embodiment in this canvas being nothing if not vexed. I mean, I went and saw this with an art historian friend, and it took us maybe 20 minutes, half an hour, standing in front of this picture to figure out what was going on here. This felt so much like this figure's back, until we realized, no, it wasn't the back, it was the front, and these two hands are there, and this is clutching the coin. So the kiss is taking place, and now Judas is recoiling and turning at the same time. When you find yourself looking at representational painting, by a master, but you also find that it takes some hard looking to understand what's going on, take that seriously. I mean, it's a kind of structure that has been built meaningfully into the painting. On the one hand, intensely physical, intensely bodily. On the other hand, you might say drawing the viewer in and distancing the viewer at the same time, making the viewer work to understand what's taking place. Indeed, another painting in this same violent, disrobing vein is the Martyrdom of St. Peter, 1618, 1619, in Modena, in which the dark-haired, simian-profiled thug at the right has been depicted pulling an improbably large expanse of blue drapery from around Peter's body, prior to the saints being tied to the cross, a portion of which can be glimpsed to the right. This, too, is a spectacularly unusual motif. I mean, how could Peter be wound round with that much blue cloth to begin with? And indicates a very particular cast of mind on the part of the artist. A cast of mind that persists, as is shown by the later Joseph and Potiphar's wife, 1649, at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., in which we find the would-be seductress, Potiphar's wife, maintaining her grip on the length of blue cloth, partly enveloping the struggling Joseph, as if removing it, which seems to be what is going on, would advance her futile attempt to lure him into her bed, the very length of the cloth suggesting that futility. Then there's one of Guercino's most masterly pictures, traditionally known as St. William of Aquitaine receiving the habit, 1620 in Bologna, and this leads me to ask whether our painter slept at all during these years. You can see the rate of production of these extraordinarily ambitious pictures, every single one of which represents a completely original conception of its subject. The saint in question being identified traditionally with a 12th century Count of Poitou, who participated in the crusade of Innocent II. During the crusade, William is said to have encountered Saint Bernard, from whom he received his habit at Parthenay. However, in a strongly argued chapter in his book, Guercino's Paintings and His Patron's Politics in Early Modern Italy, an art historian named Daniel M. Unger disputes this identification in favor of viewing the kneeling figure as an earlier St. William receiving the Pope's blessing before going on one of the so-called proto-crusades. I mean, crucially, we don't know the subject for sure. The Pope Unger has in mind is Gregory VII, an earlier pope, in his words, quote, one of the most renowned and influential pontiffs in the history of the Church, who was canonized only in the 17th century in 1606, which is interesting. Unger further suggests that in this case, quote, William is not giving up the sword for a friar's habit, which is what has traditionally been thought to be the case, a subject that he feels scarcely makes contemporary sense, quote, but removing the habit and receiving Gregory's benediction and sanctification for the sword. And when one looks in the background, one sees, men on horseback and so on and so forth. And there's also, he suggests, a possible association between Gregory VII and Guercino's frequent sponsor, Alessandro Ludovisi, who became Pope Gregory XV. Let me say at once that I'm not in a position either to endorse or to refute Unger's proposal. I will admit that I find it attractive, if only because the motif of taking off a monk's habit, even though worn above armor, therefore not revealing naked flesh when it's removed, bears an intriguing relation to the treatment of clothing and drapery in various of the paintings we've considered, starting, of course, with the Vienna Prodigal Son, and including Herminia and the Shepherd, where there's armor again. But perhaps the crucial point is the presence of the habit as such, rather than our certainty as to whether it's being received or taken off. And the copiously, superbly painted habit of the monk at the right underscores the importance of the garment as such. In fact, the monk seems to be holding in his arms another robe, as if for the protagonist's investiture, so the subject remains in doubt. We don't know for sure, but it's crucially about taking something on, taking something off. A number of other works bear closely on the issues I've been tracing. The first, from the heart of our period again, is the Elijah Fed by Ravens, 1620 in London, in which truly another astonishing picture, in which the seated but massive and looming figure of the prophet is shown holding open a length of blue-purple drapery, into which the bird at the upper right is about to deposit its twice-daily gift of bread and flesh. In this strangely gripping canvas, we are shown of Elijah's lower body only his bare right leg from above his knee, plus his left foot and ankle. But I want to propose, going further interpretively than I've done so far, that the drapery receiving food may itself be seen as a kind of extension of Elijah's body, indeed of his body's interior, I mean of the interior of his stomach, as if the interplay now between the drapery and the body is incredibly intense. So food is about to be deposited into the drapery, as if into his stomach, as if the suggestion of exchange between clothing and body that we first observed in the Vienna Return of the Prodigal Son receives here its most extreme, not to say phenomenologically outrageous expression. Indeed, the raven's gift of food itself has something of the look of a human bodily organ, making this painting even more uncomfortable to stand before once one begins to view it in these terms. A second work, also in the National Gallery in London, is the Incredulity of St Thomas, 1621 now, which at the right picks up on Caravaggio's motif of tripled absorbed disciples in Caravaggio's own Incredulity of St Thomas in Potsdam. Here the middle face has been obscured, but which belongs to our series by virtue of the wholly unusual gesture with which Christ apparently has removed his blue robe from his upper chest so as to reveal the wound in his right side. That is, again, a new invention, that we see him partially disrobing to reveal the wound. Note, too, the blowing white cloth, the billowing white cloth of the banner that he holds at the top left of the canvas, a detail that takes on added meaning in the light of Guercino's interest in clothing and related motifs. Then there is the small, exquisitely painted Mystic Marriage of St. Catherine, 1620, in the Gemälde Gallery in Berlin, in which what catches one's attention is the extraordinary bunching of the infant Christ's white shift under Mary's left hand, so as to expose his body from above his navel to his feet, another kind of disrobing, as it were. There are no crossed hands exactly, but there is a delicate encounter between Mary's and Catherine's right hands, as Mary presumably is sliding a wedding ring onto Catherine's extended finger. A fourth such picture, regarded by Dennis Mann, as a copy of the lost original, is the Susanna and the Elders, maybe of around 1618, in the Pitti in Florence, in which we find an all but naked Susanna being stripped of the last vestige of cloth, radically disrobed, by the bearded lecher at the right. Although a perfectly reasonable interpretation of the subject, the actual removal of drapery from her body is in fact an unusual choice of action, historically speaking, I mean. And what makes Guercino's canvas even more striking from my point of view, what I hope by now is our point of view, is the depiction of the elder in question, the guy at the right, with crossed arms, his inactive right arm being somewhat unnaturally traversed by his left arm and hand removing the cloth. In other words, I'm asking you to see how the same fundamental structures are happening again and again and again and again and again in a variety of subjects, a wide variety of subjects in a wide variety of contexts. Somehow, the painter has an enormous stake in these things, disrobing cross limbs. So a brief pause to take stock. My survey of paintings by Guercino has been almost exclusively focused on a brief but salient span in his career, the years 1619, 1620, when a succession of pictorially stunning and conceptually original canvases issued from his studio seemingly without letter. And my point in concentrating on these works is not simply because I regard them as the absolute high point of Guercino's art, but more importantly because they seem to me to indicate a project without exact equivalent in the painting of his time, more broadly, I'm tempted to claim, in all European painting. Simply put, I see that project as aiming to establish a new, corporeally intense, and at the same time, more often than not, subtly or not so subtly ambivalent mode of communication and exchange between the world of the painting and that of the viewer, which is to say, between painting and viewer. There's no hard and fast distinction to be made between the two pairs of terms. An earlier work in this vein is another, the more famous Susanna and the Elders, 1617 in the Prado, in which the anxious, silencing gestures of the two elders at the left seem plainly to be addressed either to at least one other of their number this side of the picture surface, or, as it's often said, to the viewer. Just as a later one is the Venus, Mars, and Cupid, 1633, in Modena, wonderful picture, in which a seated and impassive Venus points toward the beholder as Cupid draws his bow and aims his arrow in that direction. Notice, by the way, her beautiful soul, the pointing gesture, even the sense in which the arrow aimed at us crosses the bow. It's not crossed limbs, but it's something not unlike it. Her legs, of course, are crossed at the ankle. But both these paintings are somewhat basic, even perhaps a bit crude, in their mode of implication toward the viewer, as compared with what takes place in others of the paintings we just surveyed. You'll probably already have gathered that no aspect of these paintings is of greater interest to me than Guercino's preoccupation with the act of removing and, to a lesser extent, putting on clothing or drapery, which I understand is seeking to evoke a mode of bodily experience, call it auto-affection, in which the subject is to be imagined experiencing his or her bodily limits, but without a clear or exact sense of where those limits are to be found. A common enough state of affairs, phenomenologically speaking. Think of the experience of taking off or putting on a shirt. And I see this in turn as figuring a mode of pictorial experience that shares the same general characteristics. Clothing or drapery in these paintings functioning as a vehicle of what I've been calling communication and exchange, not only between depicted personages and their immediate circumstances, but also as by a kind of metaphoric, metonymic expansion between painting and viewer, as difficult as this may be to actually conceptualize. As if the viewer of the Vienna Return of the Prodigal Son, just to go back to that, is invited to imagine taking off or taking off and putting on, a quasi-bodily relation to the painting itself. The crossed limbs, too, are relevant here, being at once an intensely bodily motif and one that in Guercino's paintings works to stave off too easy or an immediate identification with the bodies in question, as I earlier said. Such a total project, I might add, at once belongs to its historical moment of the flowering of the gallery picture, the rise of a stylistic verism, indebted at once to Caravaggio and to the Carracci, the thematization of embodiment, and the rise of a new, more intense, in important respects, confrontational relation to the viewer. All of these are themes in my book, The Moment of Caravaggio. And stakes out a territory that is all its own, that is all Guercino's own, within which the very sense of an encounter between painting and viewer is qualified and displaced, one might almost say deflected, in the ways I've tried to suggest. I want now to turn to a painting that has been in my sights throughout this talk. Guercino's Samson captured by the Philistines, 1619, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. To begin with the subject, Samson, viewed from behind and seated or half-seated on a low bench, has been depicted grappling with, and we are to understand being captured by, no less than 5 Philistine soldiers. What makes this possible, of course, is that he has had his previous inviolate hair cut off while he slept, thereby depriving him of his legendary strength. And what brought that about, in turn, was first his having recklessly confided to Delilah, herself Philistine, that his hair was the secret to his invincibility. And second, his having fallen asleep on her lap, no doubt after sex, though the text of Judges is discreet on the topic. In any case, the Samson we see here is a powerful specimen, struggling mightily with his attackers, but the outcome is not in doubt. For one thing, his right forearm and wrist are firmly in the grasp of the rightmost of the Philistines. Immediately to Samson's left, a bearded soldier like the others in body armor grips the Israelite hero's left wrist with his left hand while pulling at a rope with his right. The bit of rope around Samson's right wrist suggested Delilah tied his wrists together while he slept, but that when it woke, his strength was still sufficient to snap the rope and engage with his enemies. Near the left-hand edge of the canvas, 2 other soldiers take part in the fight, the helmeted upper one brandishing a fist, the lower one wielding a wooden staff, presumably a spear, with which Samson's eyes are shortly to be put out. The metal tip is largely occluded by the bearded soldier's right hand. Among the Philistines, however, the key figure is the lighter-haired, bearded man in a cap at the top of the canvas, who holds up an open pair of scissors and seems to be calling out to others off canvas to the left, as if to announce that the crucial business has been accomplished. Indeed, lower down, just beneath the left arm of the soldier grasping Samson's wrist, there can be glimpsed the scissor man's left hand holding a comb that still contains some locks of hair. It takes serious looking in front of the painting to notice this. As to Samson's head, it appears freshly shorn, a fact underscored by the left hand of the soldier brandishing a fist, which grips the head as if to make sure that the necessary damage has been done. It's a brilliant touch in several respects. Finally, there are 2 women, one further back in space, Delilahs Maid, the figure right, that we see at the very right-hand edge of the canvas. Bearing Samson's hair, ? She seems to have both arms extended before her, as if she's carrying something away, rushing away to the right. And then another woman, the figure we see at the lower left, presumably Delilah, in seductive décolleté in the left foreground, who calmly but with determination tugs at a length of white cloth so as to free it from beneath Samson's elbow. The left-hand half, or rather 2/3 of the composition, is extremely crowded, but the relations among the figures, 7 in all, are legible if one makes an effort to work them out, with the fleeing woman at the right providing an element of release that serves to point up Samson's capture, despite the running disposition of his powerful legs and the extraordinary sense of bodily rotation on his little bench. He is plainly going nowhere. The question, of course, is how precisely the Samson relates to the other paintings of 16, 19, 20 that we've been considering. And what I want to begin by noting is an obvious point, namely that this is the only picture of these years, for that matter, the only one in Guercino's earth, that gives pride of place to a figure viewed from behind. In fact, such figures are frequently to be found in Caravaggesque tavern scenes. I'm thinking of works by Bartolomeo Manfredi, Valentin de Bologna, Nicolas Ranier, others, where they resonate with the orientation of the viewer standing before the painting, and by so doing reinforce the strong evocation of bodiliness at work in the painting as a whole. The viewer facing into the painting feels himself, herself to be kind of congruent with figures in the painting facing away. As we've seen, Guercino's canvases of 1619, 1620 eschew such a strategy, refuse such a strategy, in favor of something more diffuse and, so to speak, non-identificatory. The viewer's imagined relation is more to the prodigal son's shirt, we might say, than to the son himself, which suggests that the basic scenario of the Samson, a powerful single figure seen from behind and struggling with attackers who are on the verge of overpowering him, is perhaps to be read as indicating the limits of the system of Guercino's paintings during these years. What I mean is that Samson's tragic fate may be taken as illustrating in an exemplary or even cautionary spirit the consequences of a viewer being led to project himself or herself into the painting as opposed to being held at a near distance, however uncertain or fluctuating that distance may be, by the sorts of displacements that I've been describing. To be clear, the viewer of the 1619, 1620 works, other than the Samson, occupies no fixed or stable imaginary position relative to the painting, as may be said more or less of the viewer of paintings by the Caravaggesques. That would be something I'd have to show you. But this is where the repetitive imagery, the metaphorics and metonymics of taking off and putting on clothing or drapery come meaningfully into play. Need I state again how difficult it is to get these matters even approximately right. Put slightly differently, the Samson points up by contrast, one might almost say metapictorially, the extreme subtlety, also it turns out the fragility of the Guercino system circa 1619, 1620, by which I mean the extent to which the Guercino system involved an extraordinarily delicate and unstable balance between engaging with the viewer and denying him or her entrance to the picture, or rather between soliciting his or her imaginative involvement in the picture and deflecting it by means of the mobile play of form-dissolving chiaroscuro, the crossing of limbs so as to complicate the viewer's relation to individual persons, and the suggestion of a shifting and uncertain quasi-bodily relation to the clothing and drapery that in the Vienna canvas and elsewhere figure significantly in the depicted action, and therefore to the depicted bodies, and by further implication to the painting itself. Whereas in the Samson, Guercino has depicted his protagonist magnificently muscled and straining, naked back, not only with complete conviction, but also, this is what the conviction is about, in such a manner that the viewer is led at once to be utterly persuaded by the back's illusory reality. It's almost Michelangelesque, quasi-sculptural, and yet intensely painterly presence, and to identify projectively, and as it were bodily, with its heroic possessor and his plight, including, or at least not excluding, his imminent blinding, no small threat in the context of making and experiencing painting. And not only that, Guercino has also deliberately underscored the sense of Samson's isolation, of his abandonment to his enemies, which is also to say of a larger pictorial crisis involving the viewer, by the extraordinary piece of business of Delilah, single-mindedly and to all appearances impassively, pulling at the length of white cloth, belonging to Samson's girdle, it would seem, pinned against her thigh by the struggling hero's left elbow. Her entire body takes part in the effort, including her left arm and hand straining to move his arm, even while her coiffure is untroubled and her face remains an inexpressive mask. Unfortunately, the fingers of her left hand are mainly repaint. One can only imagine the stronger impression of force and purpose the original hand would have conveyed. Nothing indeed could more emphatically point out the importance of the disrobing or removal of clothing or drapery motif in a number of the paintings of these remarkable years than its deployment in this seemingly marginal and in any case textually unmotivated guise in the Samson. My own experience on countless visits to the 17th century Italian rooms in the Metropolitan Museum, being that the longer I stand before and the more successfully I give myself up to Guercino's violent and tragic masterpiece, arguably the most profoundly conceived painting in his oeuvre, the more firmly and irrevocably, alongside a quasi-identification with the straining hero, the more firmly and irrevocably my intention comes to be drawn to Delilah's action, which in the end establishes itself as the true center of the composition, the pivot around which everything turns. See how many lines of force converge exactly there, if not indeed as the very key to the painting's meaning. The final question is what to make of this ultimate displacement away from the figure of Samson to that of Delilah, more precisely, to her seemingly unmotivated action of pulling with all her strength at the piece of cloth, assuming it is agreed that such a displacement takes place. And my closing suggestion is that it serves to compensate for, and in a sense to undo, the viewer's otherwise catastrophic immersion in the painting, by allowing him or her to resume, to conclude by taking up a position safely outside it, that relative safety being reflected, if that is the word, in Delilah's imperturbable calm. The viewer becomes Delilah, in other words, a disconcerting thought. Thank you. No, I totally see your point. And I'm not going to for a minute say that that's not the case. But that gesture is just so amazing. It happens in the foreground, and you've got that white cloth, which you feel, probably again connects around like that.
Constraining, yeah.
Constraining, but also it's again a kind of disrobing thing. She wants to draw it away, and this is in the direction of getting us out of the picture. Again and again we're getting this structure of involvement but separation, and here the effort at separation is just being acted out by Delilah, and that's where we end up identifying. It's just so, as I say, disconcerting. Yes.
You mentioned his prodigious output during these years. What was the work? Did he have a workshop, an atelier with many assistants, etc.?
Yeah, I don't really know. And these pictures are seen as, all the pictures I've shown you, except one or two that are seen as copies, are seen as autographed. So even if he had some assistance, basically he's just churning it out. There's actually a moment, remember that St. William of Aquitaine picture? Much later he has a studio and he has students and so on. And apparently they go and look at this picture and the students just love it. They say, man, that is a truly great picture. And Guercino is supposed to have said to them, yeah, that was when I was really cooking. that was when the kettle was really boiling. And for these years, it's just astonishing. There are just very, very few moments in the history of painting, where, producing single works like this. I think of like Manet between 1862 and 65 or something, where you just, but even Manet, this is just an amazing output, amazing. What I can't adequately convey is the way every single one of these paintings represents a completely original conception of the subject, even if it's a traditional subject, the Incredulity of Thomas. But no one before has ever depicted Christ. It's that sort of thing. Again and again and again, he's thinking, feeling, and imagining in some radically original way. And then he continues to be immensely productive through the rest of his career and of great interest and so on. But this is it. These are the great ones. No question about it. But they're unbelievably great. The interesting thing is that within art history itself, everyone knows this. I mean, everyone knows that he's a great, great painter. Everyone knows he's remarkable. He is. But these pictures haven't really been touched interpretively. People have kept their distance from them. There's been a certain amount of just basic scholarship about them. But they haven't been engaged with, I'm happy to say. Yes?
How were they perceived at the time? You talked about the originality of the...
We don't really know. We don't really know. We don't have much. I mean, for example, the extreme case would be Caravaggio. But we would love to have, monthly art criticism about Caravaggio. But we have virtually no textual evidence at all from his lifetime, about how those pictures were received. The most you gather is just in terms of how other artists seem to have responded to them. So we don't have contemporary textual evidence of response to these. It's really impossible to say. He was obviously successful. These pictures were bought. In some cases, we know whom they were made for. And so he has a successful career. But it's a real problem that one has through this whole period in the 17th century. There's very little of a certain kind of textual commentary to work with.
So following up on that comment in terms of emulation and recognition on the part of younger artists, do they pick up the system? Do they recognize the system?
Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge. And he's doing this all in Cento and Bologna. It's not at all. And he goes to Rome. He makes this astonishing St. Petronilla. He does the great Aurora fresco on the ceiling, but we don't know. He has a very successful career through his whole life, and around the later 1620s, he's actually, you can see how well known he must have been, because the young Velázquez comes to Italy and actually pays Guercino a visit in Cento. He's seen enough to want to go meet Guercino and see what he has in the studio and talk to him and so on. So there are things like that. And there are paintings one painting in particular Velázquez makes after that, the Forge of Vulcan, in which there's a figure at the left whose naked back, muscular naked back, faces us, and he must have seen Samson. Or he saw an oil sketch for the Samson in Guercino's studio, something that hasn't come down to us. But we really don't know a lot. But he has a very successful career, it's clear. Yes?
Were most of his paintings commissions and then commissions for private owners or for the church?
There are pictures that are altarpieces. And then, like the St. Petronilla and others, but a lot of these were we know that there were 4 paintings that were commissioned by a man named Serra, and there are others that were done for churches, but then there are others that must have been private commissions, or he knew he had someone who would buy them. I mean, he's being collected right from the start. Again, we don't have a lot of information about him. We would love to know more, using the art historical we. But we really don't know. Yes?
Are you surprised that having made it big in Rome, that he would return in effect to the provinces?
No, No, because Rome's a very competitive setting at that time. First of all, he would have stayed longer, one suit, had his Pope lived longer. But because the Pope was giving him the commissions. Once that Pope dies and another Pope comes in with other favored artists, then, I mean, it's a tough world commercially that way. And if he doesn't have someone who's going to sponsor him, then he's going to get back to Cento, where he has a world, where he knows it's very near Bologna, which is a major center, and he knows he can reinstall himself there and make connections again. So it's not that surprising. Also, in Rome in those years, what's starting to arise is a kind of very classical mode of painting. His own work becomes more classical, it's influenced by that. But it would have been a sort of big jolt for him to have to go all that way that quickly. So it's not surprising that he left Rome. And he has a very, very successful subsequent career based in Cento and Bologna. Cento is very near Bologna. He's smart. He has a very good instinct of what's good for him. You know, even figuring out if Guido Reni is in Bologna, I'll stay 20 miles away. Yes.
There's something very awkward to me.
Yeah.
The way Delilah's hand on the left arm is placed.
Right.
Isn't that a strange position for a left arm? Is she pushing him away? Wouldn't she do it for him?
You have to ask her. You know, she's I don't know. It doesn't feel that weird to me, but you know, this is. Yeah. These things are subjective.
Did you say her left hand was overpainted?
Her left hand has been repainted. Yeah, there was paint loss here. So when you're standing in front of the picture and looking, I mean, I owe this. The Metropolitan Museum of Art has a wonderful curator of all this painting, a man named Keith Christensen, who really built the modern collection of 17th century Italian painting, and who is very, very, very knowledgeable about it. And one of the things I've enjoyed most working on all this material over the last years is just, you know, going to New York, hanging out with and spending a few hours in the gallery with him. And he's the one who pointed out to me that's repaint, and that the hand would, when you know, up close and looking at it, it would feel stronger if the fingers weren't repainted. Wouldn't feel radically different, but it would feel stronger.
So I think maybe we should leave Michael and.
No, I'm totally happy with it.